now I realize I attended, not more than dutifully, with great interest, the first three speakers. And it's put so many confusions in my mind at this point that I've forgotten quite how I was going to proceed, but give me a moment to collect myself. Yeah, the special case of, the special case of solo improvising was a problem for me in let's say, the period between when I committed myself to group improvising and had not yet embarked on solo improvising. Partly for theoretical reasons. At that point, I still believed that composition was an adequate antonym for improvisation. I've changed my position on that markedly in the intervening 50 years. Yes, 50 years. So, for me, the problem with solo improvising was all the decisions were coming from one mind. And therefore, the distinction between that and the act of determining the form of a piece of music through notation was a little bit too closely. These two activities were more or less the same thing, except you could say one was a faster form of the other. All the ideas were flowing unedited in the one mind of a solo improviser. All the ideas were being generated and edited in the course of process of composition by a composer. It was the work, those with an inside knowledge of the dynamics and history of free improvisation will be astonished to learn that it was the work of Derek Bailey, the guitarist, who's already been cited once this morning. At least you credited him. Well, that was very good. I heard exactly the same thing quoted in Athens last weekend, as though it was the work of the speaker. Very, very. So it was Derek Bailey's remark about improvisation being at the same time the least understood and most commonly practiced, or something like that. Okay. So there was almost a gasp of disbelief in the audience in Athens. How can somebody make this thing and verbatim quote Derek Bailey without citing Derek Bailey? Seemed very impolite. Okay, it was Derek Bailey's work. In listening to his solo playing, I think it was, apart from Anthony Braxton and a few isolated instances, maybe odd fragments of Jimmy Jeffrey, maybe you could argue some Lenny Tristano stuff. There wasn't very much an Eric Dolphy solo on God Bless the Child. There wasn't much stuff there, solo improvising. Anthony Braxton being for solo alto, I think, was the main precursor of Derek's work. Listening to Derek's work, I heard the beginnings of a method of replacing the interaction of other minds with the interaction with the instrument. Derek seemed to be able to set something in motion, maybe in feedback, and then play some harmonics on other strings, or two or three things happening at the same time. So it became like a kind of juggling with sounds. And I think the sheer effort of following the difficulties that he was placing himself in, both physically and in terms of the audible consequences, was producing a kind of what I would have called at that time improvisation. Okay, in the meantime, I've come to think that it doesn't really make too much sense to talk about improvisation as distinct from composition. It's clearly a form of composition. Clearly I say that. I'm not trying to be But it's a different way of composing music. And I'll try and illustrate something of the situation that I've arrived at now in solo playing, which I've been doing for not quite 50 years. No, it's less than that. But it's at least 40 odd years since I started to make solo concerts and do solo recordings. And at this point, I could touch on material from the previous, talking about multiphonics there, the oboe multiphonics. Basically, the structure of an oboe is very similar to the structure of a soprano saxophone. There's a conical tube, double reed in the case of an oboe, single reed in the case of a saxophone, produces the regular overtone series. It was the work of an Italian called Bruno Bartolozzi, New Sounds for Woodwinds, it was translated as in English, which was the first sort of information that I worked on. There's nothing specifically in that book about the saxophone, but all the principles are essentially the same. To break the column in different places, and then to see what happens. So I'll now break the column in a place where I'm not quite sure what will happen, and see where it leads. To break the column means that's the complete closed column. That's the whole column closed there to the very end, you see. So if I break the column here and here, or here and here, something interesting should happen. So you heard those things, you might call them squeaks, or we could call them the same kind of things that Pablo Picasso produced on the cello, unintended harmonics. Part of my system is to bring the unintended under control. So the first key to realizing something is there is through a mistake. You learn a new possibility of the instrument from its behavior, in spite of your best efforts to control it. Of course, your best efforts to control it have already been hampered by the fact that you are breaking the column. It's not designed to be played that way. It's designed to play, a chromatic scale from low B flat to top F, A flat to E flat. I never think about notation much anymore. Okay, so where were we? So I already find that low B gives more interesting sounds. So the column's now broken, but it's not the B flat column. It's the column off the low B, our B, so the tone away from concert pitch. Okay, so now I'm going away from the original thing and starting to do what I feel like doing, which is that's become my new definition of improvising, is doing exactly what I feel like, which includes repeating myself, doing something I've done, let's say, conservatively, 1,000 times before, or doing something I've never tried before. And usually the concerts are a mixture of both those things, hopefully. And if that sounds arrogant, what you going to do about it? Aesthetically, I think comparisons were made quite early on when I started to work with circular breathing and the system of repetitions and loopings and slow variations that permits was with the music of the early music of Steve Reich and Philip Glass to some extent. I think technically it had more to do with things that Lamont Young was doing as a saxophone player, although he never developed circular breathing as far as I can tell. And some of the things that Terry Riley was doing with tape loops. But of course, circular breathing is essential if you want that unbroken line of development. And tape loops are they're too much to carry around, basically. There's still interesting work being done with live electronics, obviously. And that might bring me to a point. Back then, in the earliest days of, that transition from group playing to solo playing, the most important group experience for me was with John Stevens, the late John Stevens, the drummer, and he called the group Spontaneous Music Ensemble. He was also pretty much quite a theoretician of how to proceed with, how to introduce people, how to encourage musicians to feel confident about improvising. He had a very nice workbook, which I think has been republished in the meantime, A Search and Reflect, I think it's called. But John's emphasis was always very much on more or less somewhere between the, I'm going to risk saying it, the spiritual and the social aspect of interaction with other human beings. It was very important for John. I'm not sure he would have approved of computers coming into the music. It's a shame he died before that really started to happen. Would have been interesting to see his take on it. So John really opened the door for me. Before I was fully formed in any sense, as a player, as a thinker, as anything, he was very generous to me. So let's hope he saw something in me which was I've subsequently justified. I don't know. I hope so. Certainly, I mean, in my own sense of self, I know that I've tried hard to do that because I will never forget and always pay tribute to John Stevens for his generosity in welcoming me into the scene. But as I say, that was a group music. One of the players inside the group was Derek Bailey. And we, in a way that must have been quite hurtful to John, we spun off a group from the Spontaneous Music Ensemble by a sequence of duos. I was playing duos on the side with Derek, basically rehearsal time, not giving performances. And Derek was also doing the same thing at the same time with a drummer called Jamie Muir, who later went on to play with King Crimson for a very, very tortured year or so, I think, before they had to let him go. I think that's the expression. So then the next logical step seemed to be what would happen if Derek, myself, and Jamie played together. That was also fairly tortured. Jamie was not an easy character, nor was Derek. So God knows how we managed, but we did, and we played. I think the reward was the music, which is always, in a group situation, more than the sum of its parts, and hard to predict at the outcome what will happen when A, B, and C. It's a bit like chemistry. When you've been working in a laboratory long enough, you know that don't mix the green liquid with the red liquid unless you put 2 drops of the black liquid. It's improvised community is the same. I see the racks of tubes with their elements and their molecules, and I'm pretty sure what will happen if you mix the wrong stuff. Mostly a bad smell. Rarely an explosion. Hey! See, stand up is what I really want to do. It's true, and I've got some good ones. I hope I remember them. So there we are, a trio. What do we do next? We are aware that we're creating something that is not the spontaneous music ensemble. It's, in a way, it's an act of disloyalty, an act of defiance, an act of suggesting that there is another way. I should say at the same time, with a maybe even longer history, is the group called AMM. Two of the original members still survive. Cornelius Cardew, the late Cornelius Cardew, was a member for a crucial period. Eddie Prevost and Keith Rowe still alive. They've had their fallings out and they're coming back together. It's the most interesting story, and probably will be written down somewhere in a huge book, but not yet. I don't think there's a huge book about Keith Rowe. I don't know if anybody's read that one. Anyway, there was a talk at the what was it called? ICA, Institute of Contemporary Arts. And at this talk, I gave a talk similar to this. So no notes, very little preparation, you know, a reliance on being an incredibly likable personality and getting you to forget that I haven't done much work to prepare, which in this case fits the theme of the symposium very well. And does improvisare also come from unforeseen? You read various etymologies of the word. It's when you get into that etymological thing, it gets very tricky. Okay, so AMM, I characterized in a way that there was a woman there called Hannah Charlton who made some notes about my talk. And that's the only evidence that I said these things. But they've been taken up in the same way that Derek Bailey's expression has been taken up. I characterized the SME approach as atomistic, the AMM approach as laminar, and of course I was setting the scene for the music improvisation company, which cannot be simply characterized as atomistic or laminar. It's both, it's everything. It's a universal approach to improvising. And stop me if you think that this is going too far, but I think the music improvisation company language has become a kind of lingua franca of free improvisation as practiced, certainly in Europe, and it has had echoes in other places as well. I know there are many different histories of improvisation. You have Musica Elettronica Viva, you have the Gruppo Nuova Consonanza, and you have that group in Japan that I can never remember the name of. And you have instances of academic dabblings. No disrespect. Or as I say in Parliament, with the greatest respect. I've subsequently come to value more highly the work of the AACM, which at the time there was not very good information channels between Chicago and London. We knew a lot about what had happened in New York, but we didn't know much about what was happening in Chicago. I mentioned the name Anthony Braxton. In a way, Anthony was one of our key entry points into learning more about the Chicago scene. But by that time, he was no longer really living in Chicago. And of course, in the meantime, George Lewis has become a distinguished research professor of music at Columbia. George Lewis, the former trombone, well, he still plays trombone, but was known originally as a great trombone player playing with Anthony Braxton. But is dabbling enough? I'm not sure. He certainly had his fingers in the very earliest computer music stuff that was going on, and has stayed in contact with both those strands very well in the intervening 40-odd years. So, two things that I learned from thinking more recently about the AACM. One is their slogan, ancient to the future. And that has meaning for me now because clearly you blow through a tube with a reed on it. You're not very far removed from the Launatus instrument of Sardinia. You're not far, well, you are removed because there are 3 reeds, but you know what I mean. It's a tube, it's got some holes, you wiggle your fingers, you blow into it, all kinds of interesting things happen. You follow the more interesting things, and you leave the less interesting things, and you go on like that. I've often used the analogy with an earthworm, crawling slowly through the earth, eating the things that interest it, and leaving behind the things which it no longer needs. Scatological humor. Excuse me. There's some truth to that. That seems to be the way I operate. And I take that to be something to do with ancient to the future. The future is that way for the worm, and the past is that way, but everything is part of one story. And here it touches on the more metaphysical aspects. Here we are. It's all part of it. People think that they can explain it all. This Hawkins, this remarkable character, how has he got to where he is today with this? Anyway. And apparently this is all chance. How is that? How is that? Please explain that to me. It's the most ridiculous theory of all, that suddenly, boom, there's a Big Bang. Great TV program, but it's not enough. It's a very inadequate explanation of why we're here in this room talking about the minutiae of improvisation at this moment in time.